to today's video. This is a B1 level social studies lesson, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the civil rights movement. So, segregation and change. In the mid-1950s, segregation was legal across the United States. Many states had laws that enforced segregation in public places. However, around 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 removed segregation laws. So, how do you think that this big change happened in such a short period of time? And what do you think that people did? So, before we find out the answers to those questions, we're going to look at some vocabulary words. So, soldiers is number 3, troops. The act of combining two or more things into one would be number 7, integration. An official decision would be number 1, ruling. To go with somebody to protect them, that would be number 4, escort. A protest in which a group of people refuse to leave a place until people listen to them, that would be number 6, a sit-in. To say something officially or publicly would be number 2, to declare. Not using physical force or hurting others is number 5, nonviolent. And something that doesn't follow the rules in a country's constitution would be number 8, unconstitutional. All right, so we're going to read about education and then answer the questions true or false. The civil rights movement was very active in schools and colleges. In the early 1950s, there was segregation in many schools across the U.S. However, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court made an important ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education case. The court declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Following this, 9 African American students tried to attend a previously all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, but they were stopped. Consequently, President Eisenhower ordered federal troops to escort the students to school to be sure that the students could enter. A few years later, African American students in Greensboro, North Carolina, did nonviolent sit-ins at segregated lunch counters in 1960 to protest segregation. They peacefully sat at the counters and would not leave until the waiters served them food. The actions of these students and others increased pressure to end segregation. So, are the statements true or false? The Brown versus Board of Education case ended segregation in the United States. Well, that's not completely true. It just declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. So it didn't address all segregation, but just segregation related to public schools. Federal troops prevented 9 African American students from attending a previously all-white high school. That's false. The troops were there to actually escort the students to school to make sure that they could attend. And in 1960, African American students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to attend school because of segregation. That's false. They had they did nonviolent sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. Okay, we have a few more vocabulary words. So actions that cause harm would be number 3, violence. To refuse to buy, use, or do something as a way of protesting, that's a boycott. What you do or say as a result of something that is said or done to you, that's number 5, response. To control by making decisions, rule, number 4. To help or encourage, Be number 6, to support. To question or disagree with something, often because you think it is wrong or unfair. That would be to challenge, number 2. And to say no or not accept or do something is number 7, to refuse. All right, public transport was another area of protest. In 1955, African American citizens in Montgomery, Alabama, decided to boycott city buses to protest segregated seating. They refused to ride buses for more than a year to demand equal treatment. This protest was known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott ended after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. 6 years later, in 1961, activists organized freedom rides to challenge segregation on interstate transportation. They rode buses from the north to the south to test if segregation still existed, and they were met with violence from white groups who did not support integration. Despite the violent response, the Freedom Riders continued their protests, and their efforts helped change segregation laws in the United States. So, what was the Montgomery bus boycott? Well, it was when African American citizens refused to ride the buses for more than a year to demand equal treatment. How did it end? Well, it ended when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. What were the freedom rides? These were activists who rode buses from the north to the south to test if segregation still existed. And did everyone support the freedom rides? No, they did not. So they were met with violence from the white groups that did not support integration. So think about what we've read so far and then discuss these questions. The people who participated in the freedom rides faced a violent response, but they didn't respond with violence. I'm really impressed that they just continued protesting peacefully. So what do you think of the tactics used by the civil rights movement? And how do you feel when you read about the protests? All right, we have a few more vocabulary words. To make sure that something happens, that would be number 6, to ensure. To happen is number 2, to take place. To not allow something to happen is number 7, to prohibit. To keep safe from harm or danger is number 3, protect. An event in which people or things are together in one place for a specific reason is number 1, gathering. The time when an important change takes place, that would be number 5, a turning point. And to treat someone unfairly or differently based on factors like their race, religion, gender, or other characteristics. Oh, sorry, not number 5. This one is the time when an important is number 4. This is number 4, turning point. And this one is number 5, discriminate. Okay, finally, after years of effort, things began to change. In 1963, a large gathering called the March on Washington took place in the U.S. Capitol. More than 250,000 people came together to demand laws that would protect the civil rights of everyone. One of the most famous leaders of this movement was Martin Luther King Jr. He gave a speech called I Have a Dream, which asked for an end to racial discrimination. The March on Washington was a turning point in the fight for civil rights. The protesters finally succeeded, and in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This law made it illegal to discriminate against people because of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So what was the March on Washington? So it was a large gathering where people came together to demand laws that would protect the civil rights of everyone. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? So he gave the very famous I Have a Dream speech. And the Civil Rights Act was a law that made it illegal to discriminate against people because of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. All right, we'll read this next section and then answer the questions true or false. But before we read, we have a couple of vocabulary words. Civilian is a regular person who is not a part of the military or government. Regardless of is used when something is true or happens in all situations. Despite the success of the Civil Rights Act, it was still difficult when African Americans tried to vote. In 1965, civil rights activists organized a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to demand voting rights for African Americans. The march faced violence from both police and civilians along the way, but it led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibited discriminatory practices that were used to prevent African Americans from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a very important movement in the civil rights movement. Very important moment in the civil rights movement, which ensured that all citizens, regardless of their race, had the right to vote and participate in the democratic process. So the Civil Rights Act ended all discrimination against African Americans. That's false because there was still discrimination when it came to voting. The Voting Rights Act tried to stop African Americans from voting illegally. That was false. It was designed to give them the right to vote. And the Voting Rights Act helped only African Americans. That is false. It helped all citizens regardless of race. Okay, determination. When I think about the civil rights movement, am always amazed at the determination of the activists. The Civil Rights Act was successful, but they didn't stop there and worked towards the Voting Rights Act. We need to follow their example and continue today to make society better for everyone. So, what impresses you most about the civil rights movement? Why is determination important? And what is something that you can do today to make society better? All right, now we're going to talk briefly about sequencing language. Sequencing language is a type of language that is used to describe the order in which events happen. In English, there are many words and phrases that can be used to show sequence or order of events, such as first, next, then, after that, and finally. By using these words and phrases, you can help your listener or reader to understand the order of the events or actions you are describing. First, activists organized peaceful protests and demonstrations to demand equal rights. Then, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. came and delivered powerful speeches. After that, events such as the Montgomery bus boycott drew national attention to the cause. And finally, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. Also, giving reasons. In English, there are also many expressions that we use to explain why something happened or why we think it happened. Some expressions come between two complete sentences. The first sentence describes the reason, and the second describes the consequence. African Americans faced a lot of injustices. As a result, the civil rights movement began. The Civil Rights Act became law in 1964. Consequently, U.S. society started to change. The Civil Rights Act was not enough. Therefore, the Voting Rights Act was also passed. So some expressions come before a noun or noun phrase within a sentence, and the order of the reason and the consequence can be changed. So the civil rights movement grew due to the efforts of its members. As a result of the Voting Rights Act, African Americans were able to vote freely. All right, so we've got some key events of the civil rights movement. So we're going to look at the timeline and then read the description. It says underline the language for sequencing and explaining reasons. So we have Brown versus the Board of Education was on May 17, 1954. The Little Rock Nine was September 25, 1957, and the sit-ins began on February 1st, 1960. So the Brown versus Board of Education case declared that segregation was unconstitutional. Consequently, there were protests in schools and colleges. After some time, in 1957, a group of black students known as the Little Rock Nine attended a previously all white school. Later, in 1960, there were sit ins in North Carolina. So now you'll write a full summary of the civil rights movement, and you'll use this timeline to help you. And make sure that you use language to explain sequence and to give reasons. And finally, we have some more vocabulary practice. So it says complete the sentences with the correct form of the words from the boxes, and more than one answer may be possible. Okay, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education was a significant moment in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King declared that I have a dream in his famous speech during the March on Washington. Troops were sent to Little Rock, Arkansas to protect 9 black students who were joining a previously all-white school. The police officers maybe escorted the Freedom Riders who were protesting segregation on buses. A sit-in was a form of peaceful protest where people would stay in a segregated place until they were served or arrested. Integration was a key goal of the civil rights movement, which aimed to end segregation and join society as one. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a turning point in the civil rights movement. And during the civil rights movement, activists worked hard to challenge and change laws that allowed institutions to discriminate against African Americans based on their race. All right, so here are some reflection questions. So, what were some of the key events of the civil rights movement? What was the Civil Rights Act and why was it important? What was the Voting Rights Act and why was it important? And what are some things that we can learn from the civil rights movement? And that brings us to the end of today's video. Please like, subscribe, share, and if you have any questions or comments, leave those for me in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.